Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share some thoughts on Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry, an explosive book published in 1947, regarded in some quarters as a monument in 20th century literature. Modern Library had it in the top 12 or top 15 novels. Some, I think, regarded as part of this last flowering of the modernist tradition, along with Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, published just a few years later. And it's a very strong book. I don't know if it quite reaches those levels of excellence, but it's a very powerful book. And it's a book that is steeped in those modernist traditions, but that points a through line towards the future of confessional literature, confessional poetry, and sort of the autofiction that we see, permeating the 21st century, for better and worse. And it is a very powerful book because Lowry leaves himself on every page of this novel. He wrote it was published in 1947, but he was writing it for close to a decade. And it's primarily set on the Day of the Dead in 1938 in a small town in Mexico that is sort of, at the base of some mountains where there's volcanoes in the distance. And that sense of doom at any moment, that everything could erupt and end, the world could end, these characters' lives could end at any moment, pervades just about every page of this book. It is not a happy book. It is not a joyful book. And it's not a particularly inspirational book. Lowry's life is on every page of this novel. His emotional fractures, the sort of mental fractured mental state he existed in, his despair, his alcoholism are just covering this novel. But there's also a real sense of time and place that a book set in 1938, the world is reaching a very crucial point and a horrible point. Awful things have been occurring in Europe, in Manchuria, around the world, but they're about to ratchet up to a much higher degree than anyone in 1938 can realize. And looking back a decade later, Lowry could understand how critical it was to represent that idea that not only is the world ending, but that there's not necessarily a bright light coming forward. This is a very dark book, and even the moments that are bright seem to almost be revealed as lit up by raging fires that are about to just consume everything. So it's a book to, I think, be careful going into with where you're at personally as a reader and your own life, because it's unremitting at times, but it is powerful. And I want to kind of break out a sort of who, what, when, where, why with this book, because it is just stuffed with symbolism. It's stuffed with ideas. So who is in this book? We have four characters. Two of them, I think, are idealized versions of the best and worst selves of Lowry himself. So we have a pair of brothers, Geoffrey Firmin, the consul, a sort of Christ figure, the main character of this book, a consul who is sort of fallen into disgrace. He doesn't really seem to even have his job anymore. Diplomatic relations have been severed, but he's there in this town, setting up some, trade deals almost, or that was what he should be doing. And he has been separated from his wife, Yvonne, for some time, sort of portraying some of the difficulties that Lowry had in his own marriage and his own relationships. And so Geoffrey Firmin is there. He has a younger brother, Hugh, who really is the idealized best version of Lowry's self. He has lived part of his time as a sailor. He works as a reporter. He's active in progressive causes worldwide. He's, of course, supporting, the Republicans in Spain and during the Spanish Civil War, a doomed and lost cause. And Hugh is romantic. He wears a cowboy hat. He can ride a horse. He seems to have this life of adventure. And he and his sister-in-law, Yvonne, are close, perhaps almost like weirdly close. And I think there's this aspect where Lowry took his own biography of as a in terms of his career and these hopes he'd had, and he gives those to Hugh Firmin, who incidentally is about the same age Lowry was when this book would have taken place in 1938. 29 years old. So we have this idealized version of Lowry, and then we have the consul, who seems to be almost this demonic version of Lowry, the version of Lowry that he's afraid of, that takes all of his struggles, all of his failures, and then encapsulates those into a character, and then just takes it out to an exponential degree. There is, as I had mentioned, Yvonne, the estranged wife of the consul, who has suddenly arrived back in this town and is, hoping to leave with him for some better future. And then the fourth character is an interesting one. It's Monsieur Laurel, a childhood friend of the consul, seems to have also been very close to Yvonne, and he's the character who opens our book and gives us this window into, looking down on the valley, looking at the volcano, looking at the town, and remembering what happened a year ago. And he almost functions as a Greek chorus to a certain extent. He's less an agent within the book. We don't really get into his mind in the same way that we do Geoffrey, Hugh, and Yvonne. So that's who we're dealing with. I'd mentioned when we are. We're in 1938. We're in Mexico. And we see the terror and the horror of the world starting to just really burst at the seams. And I think there's a very clear through line in the book with the sort of the end of the world as described in the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, because there are certain motifs that appear. So we have 12 hours. The book's divided into 12 chapters, and there's sort of this sense of 12 hours. And the number 7 repeats across the book. So there are chapters that begin at 7 a.m., like a character arrives getting off a train or off a bus at 7 a.m. We hear later on at the very end of the book, a clock is striking 7 times for 7 p.m. And so we have this sense of 12 chapters breaking out, a day, not a night, but a day, not a full 24-hour day, but a day of 12 hours, of daylight. And then we have this motif of 7. There's I had mentioned the clock that chimes 7 times. There's a rooster that crows 7 times. And there's a horse that we see a couple of times. Hugh and Yvonne see it, and it has a 7 branded on its side. They see it early in the morning. It's seen later on in chapter 8 when sort of the critical like turnkey chapter of the book with the violence and destruction that they encounter in that chapter. We see that the horse of a man who's been killed has that same number 7 branded on it, and then that horse is there at the very end of the book in quite terrifying fashion as the violence reaches its denouement. And so that 7 repeats, and I want to, there's a reference to the 7th seal in the book of Revelation, but I think the 6th seal is just as relevant. And this is from Revelation chapter 6. And I beheld when he had opened the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every freeman, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? And it continues on, and then in the very first verse of chapter 8, and when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. And famously, Ingmar Bergman took that as, the silence of God in this existentialist sense of how can God be silent when there's all this evil in the world? And the evil that was in the world and very publicly in the world in 1938, not just the Holocaust and the pogroms that were being forced against Jews in Europe, or the violence in Asia, in Manchuria, or the various show trials in the Soviet Union. All of those were occurring simultaneously and becoming much more public. The violence against Africans as European powers tried to sort of assert their final flourishes of colonialism. All of this was occurring in 1938 in very public fashion, the violence in the Spanish Civil War. And yet, I think what we see is rather that at that moment when God is silent, if God is resting on the 7th day in Genesis, that means the world is turned over to its worst impulses. And that's what we see on every page of Under the Volcano. As an example, here's the consul. The consul sat helplessly in the bathroom, watching the insects which lay at different angles from one another on the wall, like ships out in the roadstead. A caterpillar started to wiggle toward him, peering this way and that, with interrogatory antennae. A large cricket with polished fuselage clung to the curtain, swaying it slightly and cleaning its face like a cat, its eyes on stalks appearing to revolve in its head. He turned, expecting the caterpillar to be much nearer, but it too had turned, just slightly shifting its moorings. Now a scorpion was moving slowly across towards him. Suddenly the consul rose, trembling in every limb. But it wasn't the scorpion he cared about. It was that all at once the thin shadows of isolated nails, The stains of murdered mosquitoes, the scars and cracks of the wall had begun to swarm, so that wherever he looked, another insect was born, wriggling instantly toward his heart. It was as if, and this was what was most appalling, the whole insect world had somehow moved near and now was closing, rushing in upon him. For a moment, the bottle of tequila at the bottom of the garden gleamed on his soul. Then the consul stumbled into his bedroom. Here there was no longer that terrible, visible swarming, yet, lying now on the bed, it still seemed to persist in his mind, much as the vision of the dead man earlier had persisted, a kind of seething, from which, as from the persistent rolling of drums heard by some great dying monarch, occasionally a half-recognizable voice dissociated itself. And he then hears, he has these conversations within his consciousness. So we see this world falling apart. The world at large is falling apart, but the consul himself is falling apart. He has no job. His diplomatic ties have been severed between the UK and Mexico, with some various industries nationalized. So he has no real job. He has no diplomatic standing there, yet he remains in this town. His marriage is in ruins. His relationship with his brother, with his close friend from childhood, Monsieur Laurel, all of those seem to be in ruins. His own physical health is deteriorated. He can barely walk across, from the town square, or do a bar crawl and then make it back to his house where he can sleep. So physically he's deteriorated. Mentally, he's having these conversations in his mind. He's filled with doubt. He's filled with these deep recriminations towards himself, towards others. The conversations he has with Yvonne when she returns are incredibly unpleasant. The way he views his brother Hugh, almost as this fool and this clown, and he projects his own failures out all over the world. And so it really is all falling apart. There's a true hell on earth across the book. And then we see these characters who are utterly beaten down. Geoffrey and Yvonne have a desire to leave, to flee to some home, and she has this dream of what that life could be like. Coincidentally, it's exactly the life that Lowry and his wife ultimately would have in the 1940s. He took that actual life and made it this hopeful dream for these characters who may never actually achieve it. And it doesn't feel like they'll ever achieve it. And so that exists within the book. But as I had mentioned, there's a deep level of violence that exists, on the level of what we find in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian or in other works like that. There is sometimes in thunder another person who thinks for you, takes in one's mental porch furniture, shuts and bolts the mind's window against what seems less appalling as a threat than as some distortion of celestial privacy, a shattering insanity in heaven, a form of disgrace forbidden mortals to observe too closely. But there is always a door left open in the mind, as men have been known in great thunderstorms to leave their real doors open for Jesus to walk in. For the entrance and the reception of the unprecedented, the fearful acceptance of the thunderbolt that never falls on oneself, for the lightning that always hits the next street, for the disaster that so rarely strikes at the disastrous likely hour. And it was through this mental door that Yvonne, still balancing herself on the log, now perceived that something was menacingly wrong. In the slackening thunder, something was approaching with a noise that was not the rain. It was an animal of some sort, terrified by the storm, and whatever it might be, a deer, a horse, unmistakably it had hooves. It was approaching at a dead run, stampeding, plunging through the undergrowth. And now, as the lightning crashed again and the thunder subsided, should her protracted neigh become a scream, almost human in its panic. The emotional horror that Geoffrey Fearman has been experiencing throughout the book, the doubts that Hugh has had about the choices he's made, about his failures, and the lost causes he's been a part of, the questions Yvonne has had around should she try to reunite with with her husband, the consul, should they try to capture this dream that requires them to take a bus. They need to leave today if they're going to grab hold of this dream. All of that comes out in this just horrifying final hour. And so she's dreaming of this house, and what she sees is here we go. The sloping shingled woodshed on whose roof the white dogwood blossoms fell, but would fall no more, for the tree was burning, the fire was spreading faster and faster. The walls with their mill-wheel reflections of sunlight on water were burning. The flowers in the garden were blackened and burning. They writhed, they twisted, they fell. The garden was burning. The porch where they sat on spring mornings was burning. The red door, the casement windows, the curtains she had made were burning. Geoffrey's old chair was burning. His desk and now his book. His book was burning. The pages were burning, burning, burning. Whirling up from the fire, they were scattered, burning along the beach. And now it was growing darker and the tide coming in. The tide washed under the ruined house. The pleasure boats that had ferried song upstream sailed home silently over the dark waters of Ariadnes. Their house was dying. Only in agony went there now. And the crucial moment of the book is not the despair, and it's not that horrifying climax. It's that earlier that day, the consul and Yvonne and Hugh had seen an indigenous Mexican who they had seen earlier in the day, and he's been basically murdered there at the side of the road. And it's his horse that keeps popping up throughout this book, sort of that pale horse from, again, Revelation. He's been murdered there, and they see someone else just casually has robbed the man, and there's no sense for why he was murdered. He doesn't seem to have been murdered in order to be robbed. He was murdered, and then some other person just happened to rob him. But that casual violence that exists, that is part of their world and part of their daily experience. And there's this desire in Hugh, of course, who's involved in all these causes to end these things, to act. Yvonne sees it and can see, the future of this could be her husband at any hour. Geoffrey sees it and sees that this is the world he's been part of. The violence he was part of during World War I comes back and haunts him. And so all of these sort of collide in this interaction, and nobody chooses to do anything, as again, so many were choosing not to do anything across the 1930s as all of that violence, escalated. And so Lowry here is sort of crying out on, this desire to go back and do something, to change something, to take some type of action, even if it's doomed to failure, I think. And that final part with the house burning, I think it was inspired by his own house burning and his wife basically rescuing the manuscript for this book from the flames as the house was burning. It's a very strong book. It's a haunting book, but it is very effective. I'd be curious to know what other people think of it if they've read it. This is a little bit longer than I usually like my videos to be. But Christopher Marlowe's Faustus was I think, crucial inspiration for this book. That sense of the final chorus about, the bough being cut, the laurel being cut, as Faustus is dragged to hell. That these are characters who are existing in that moment across an entire day. The writings of D.H. Lawrence, sort of the sense of just real physical and emotional horror colliding, that manifest in Women in Love, or even The Rainbow to a certain extent, I think are and his best stories certainly are there. When I think of the Spanish Civil War, and Hugh brings up all these associations, I think the finest novel of the Spanish Civil War, Uncertain Glory by Joan Sales. I did a video on this like 2 years ago. It's one of my all-time favorite books now, and so I'll try to link that in the description box. Within modernism, of course, something like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, I think, is a true apotheosis in the modernist tradition. I had mentioned in The Sun Hath Looked Upon Me by Calixta Biala that there's a sense of that that real emotional violence and physical violence in this book as well, and that it reminded me of certain aspects of Under the Volcano, but I think it was a little more lucid. It was a little clearer in terms of being able to sort of make connections around what was happening. William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, again with 4 narrators who are each sort of revealing their own perspective of what's happening and shifting. Certainly came to mind. The allegorical nature of The Man Who Lived Underground from Richard Wright, which I read last month and absolutely loved. That deep, authentic living one's life out on the page, living one's despair out on the page, reminded me of Last Words from Montmartre by Chiu Miaojin, which I read last summer. I think there's a way in which sort of some of the works of Guy de Maupassant and the way he views the world from such a pessimistic point of view, the way he views human relationships from such a pessimistic point of view, such as in Like Death, were on display in Under the Volcano. And I had mentioned Cormac McCarthy. Perhaps The Orchard Keeper, even more so than Blood Meridian, reminded me of this work. And then Appointment in Samarra from John O'Hara, I think is relevant with that sense of doom, that there's just almost this fatalistic sense of what will happen to characters, but also the stories of John Cheever, particularly writers and characters who are experiencing alcoholism. We're on the page. But this was Under the Volcano, and I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.